Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Annick Glode, and I'm the curator of the Varley Art Gallery of Markham in Ontario, Canada. First, while we were all connecting from our various locations in the real world, across Canada, across the United States, we have people from Europe, from Vietnam, Bahrain, Norway, the Philippines, Australia joining us today. Thank you for that. I would still like to acknowledge that the Varley Art Gallery is situated on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land, and in particular, the First Nations community in closest proximity to us in York Region, the Chippewas of Georgina Island. For us, this statement means that the gallery is committed to truth, to learning the history of this land by doing our own research, by listening, and by collaborating. Online is the joint initiative between Markham Public Art and the Varley Art Gallery of Markham. It delves into the potential of public art production and social engagement in the digital sphere. Driving it is the central question. Can this time of uncertainty be productive? Can it be an opportunity for us to pause and reflect, to reshape and imagine new public spatial relationships, whether built or natural, virtual or physical? Arising directly from the City Council approved Markham Public Art Master Plan 2020-2024, Online explores the multiple factors that steer the making of public art, how artworks find their sites and become public. Unfolding over the summer of 2020, Online has two parts: a practical webinar series on public art titled Homework, which is co-produced with public art consulting firm Art Plus Public Unlimited, and an online competition for speculative public art proposal titled Delimit. The entire initiative is hosted on and distributed by a publicly available networks of digital platforms. On behalf of the Varley Art Gallery, I would like to thank the Ontario Arts Council and the Varley Mackay Art Foundation of Markham for their ongoing support. I'll pass it along to Yan, who will introduce today's session.
Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Yan Wu, the Public Art Curator at the City of Markham. And thanks, Nick. Welcome online. Thank you all for coming. I really wish I can see your face. And in the physical room situation, now it's about time for us to make eye contact. As mentioned by Nick, we have prepared a summer-long online program on public art for you all to participate, whether you consider yourself as the maker or the viewer or the producer. The reason behind choosing this platform is obviously COVID related. When Markham City Council formally approved the Public Art Master Plan, as Nick mentioned earlier, and the related implementation plan, I was planning a 3-day International Public Art Summit for June. Actually, it was supposed to happen a week ago, with public art consultant Rebecca Carbon, who is also one of the producers behind today's homework. Thank you, Rebecca, for being part of this. It has been a great pleasure working with you. A few weeks later, COVID-19 happened. And like everything else and everyone else, we had to postpone the summit to the fall and explore ways to move it online. Today's event is part of this ongoing exploration. Please send us your feedback after the events and let us know how to improve, what works, what doesn't, what is missing. Help us to get ready for the larger summit in the fall. I believe we all have learned a lot about public space during this special time, the power of it, whether in virtual or in physical, what it means to be part of this space as a participating individual, as an agency. There is still a lot to learn, and the role of public art is definitely part of this learning curve. Back to today's program, Homework. It is a webinar series that is designed to explore the practical knowledge needed to conceptualize and to produce public art project, while focusing specifically on 3 themes: forms of rendering, proposal design, and the materiality and the fabrication. I do want to add one note here that our idea of being practical in this case does not mean we try to run a vocational school that is to teach technical skills. What we are interested in is to provide a platform for knowledge exchange and production that is rooted in practice, but charged with critical awareness and imagination. A variety of professionals working in the discipline will contribute their voices throughout the week. We had a wonderful session on rendering on Monday, another exciting one upcoming on Friday. The registration link can be found in the chat box. Today's topic is proposal design. I guess it's $1 million question and everybody wants to know the answer. Is it concept, scale, material, or the ability to manage a budget? How do artists unify studio practice and a site-specific response and address the community? Understanding how to do it, personally, I also hope will enable the agency of artists, becoming the interface leading us toward systematic changes in this field. In this webinar, Chloë Catán, Public Art Manager at Waterfront Toronto, and David Turnbull, Director of Public Art and Conservation at Edmonton Arts Council, will share insights on how to design a convincing public art proposal and the landscape of current and future public art opportunities. Just a quick note, if you have any questions during the presentations, please submit them to the Q&A box. There will be a dedicated Q&A period in today's session. Appreciate your patience. Now, with great pleasure, I'm going to introduce today's moderator, Crystal Mowry. Crystal Mowry is Senior Curator at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. Her work often explores the tension between perceived authenticity and a troubled form of representation. Her curatorial projects include numerous solo exhibitions and group exhibitions such as The Limits in 2011, Imitation of Life in 2015, The Brain is Wider Than the Sky in 2018, and I Will Be on Mirror in 2018. Her solo projects with Ontario-based artists Maggie Grote and Ernest Dateweiler has received Exhibition of the Year awards from the Ontario Association of Art Galleries. In 1913, she co-curated Romancing the Anthropocene, a group exhibition situated in Toronto's financial district for Nuit Blanche. Now, let me switch the camera and welcome Crystal. Just give me a second. And I should stop that and I should leave. Just give me a quick second. Okay, here you go.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Yan. I'm delighted to be invited to participate in this conversation today. I am coming to you all from my office at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. And the gallery is situated in an area known locally as the Civic District. As its name suggests, the district is a space in which multiple facets of civic life converge. It includes a mix of residential dwellings, the municipal library's main branch, the regional police headquarters, and government buildings. At the center of this district is a parquet, which houses a playground, a memorial to fallen firefighters, and a single beam salvaged from the rubble left at the site of the World Trade Towers in New York. While the specific rationale for this form of public art remains unclear and far from holistic, the result is an alien presence in a space which previously served as a civic salve, with imagery and an aesthetic that seems deeply rooted in a European tradition of memorial statuary. One can't help but ponder how this speaks to those who live in the present, let alone those who will come in the future. We are in an exciting moment, though, so I don't want to dwell too much on that particular situation. But I believe this is a moment when we are thinking carefully about the histories of statues, of the space occupied by outdated imagery, and the distillation of power within civic space. It's a time when we are being encouraged to imagine alternate lifestyles for the art that lives in our shared spaces. The primary conditions for public art haven't changed, though. We are still concerned about weather and elements and the management of financial resources. But maybe our expectations for the role that art plays in public life has changed. My hope is that we might be able to dig down a little further into that subject during today's webinar. Today, we're honored to have both guest presenters who will share their insights on what makes a successful proposal for public artwork. Both of our presenters will share brief slide presentations, which will offer us an introduction to the unique contexts in which their experience is rooted. These presentations will be followed by a discussion in which we will reflect on themes such as making the transition from a studio to public practice and making that evident in your proposal, the importance of knowing a site, how to balance subtlety and spectacle, and how we may even engage in some speculation about what shifts may emerge in the near future as a result of the recent past that we've all shared. On that note, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Chloë Catán has managed public art commissions for Millennium Park in Chicago, the Vancouver Sculpture Biennale, Hermann Park in Houston, and Michigan State University. Previously the Acting Public Art Curator for the City of Mississauga, Chloë currently runs the public art program for Waterfront Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Chloë Catán.
Thanks, Crystal. I will share my screen for everyone. I will do a quick presentation on Waterfront Toronto's public art program, and then I can hand it over back to Crystal. There we go. Hopefully you can all see my screen. So Waterfront Toronto is the tripartite government agency that is responsible for revitalizing Toronto's waterfront. We have a robust public art program that began in 2009. And since then, we've been building important collections in the neighborhoods that we're building. You know, as we plan neighborhoods, we see public art as a really integral component of the public realm. Right, so the Waterfront Toronto Public Art Program. The first step is, you know, when we conceptualize public art plans for each precinct, that is, you know, or neighborhood, you know, we sort of use these sort of public art plans as a blueprint for projects as funding becomes available. The first plan to be written was for the West Don Lands neighborhood in Toronto, and you can see right here in the bottom hand right corner the cover of this document. It was written in 2011, and that was sort of the beginning of our public art program. So whenever an artist applies to an opportunity, it's really important for them to familiarize themselves with these documents, as it gives them a context for the project and how it fits in with the larger plan for the neighborhood, and perhaps some overarching themes for art that we've been thinking of. Here are some artworks that are currently installed in that neighborhood. My colleague Rebecca Carbon, who is here with us today, did a great job of managing most of these projects before I came along. In Clockwork, this is Water Guardians by Jennifer Marmon and Daniel Borens on Front Street. Next, going clockwise, is Untitled or Lampposts by Tadashi Kawamata, also on Front Street. You have Mirage by Paul Raff and Underpass Park. And then down here, Garden of Future Follies by Hadley and Maxwell, also on Front Street. Peeled Pavement by Jill Anholt on Mill Street. And this one down here in the middle is No Shoes by Mark DeSovero, which was already owned by the city, but was in storage, and it was restored and installed in Corktown Common. And then here, down here on the left, is Site Specific by Scott Yunson and Marianne Lovink at Shumack and Eastern. You know, as soon as these artworks are installed, we transfer. Actually, let me go back to this one again, because I want to talk about West Don Lands a little bit more. As soon as these artworks are installed, we transfer them to the City of Toronto, and they become part of the municipal collection. And then coming up, you know, for West Don Lands, we have two really exciting projects at the King Queen River Triangle and the future Anishinaabe Health Center. We'll be working with an Indigenous curator to commission two important Indigenous artworks for these sites that are near the Don River. In East Bayfront, that's another precinct. We have two works already installed. On the left, this is Light Showers by Jill Anholt, which is part of the incredible kind of stormwater system at Sherbourne Common North. So it's very much integrated into the infrastructure of the neighborhood. And then here on the right, which is the newest addition to Waterfront Toronto, it's Lightkeeper by Calgary-based artists Caitlin Brown, Wayne Garrett, and Studio North. This is a really beautiful artwork, and it has a moon clock and rainbow projections that move across the new Aitken Place Park. So what's next for East Bayfront? If you look at our public art master plan, a lot of these sort of middle sort of smaller circles have artworks that have already been implemented, some by the city's Percent for Art program. And these large ones along the top will be artworks at Jarvis, Sherbourne, and Parliament underpasses. But the one that we're focusing on now is called what we call the Destination art piece, which is the largest commission that Waterfront Toronto has ever done, right at the water's edge, at Sherbourne Common. And this will be, hopefully a really, really innovative, exciting piece that will examine the city's relationship with the water. The RFQ, or the Request for Qualifications, was the first stage of a call. Is here on the right, the pink document, and that closed very recently. And we'll have a jury soon, convening to sort of develop, to shortlist artists who will develop proposals for that particular call. So last year we launched a new temporary art program in order to further activate public spaces along the water's edge. People sort of know Waterfront Toronto as sort of implementing large permanent pieces of public art, but we think it's really, really important to also activate the water's edge with really, really dynamic pieces of temporary and ephemeral art, which can be very timely and powerful. It can move faster, obviously, than big permanent pieces, and so you can address issues that are very timely and important to communities. And it can foster healthy public dialogue about art and community, and also, really importantly, it can open up opportunities for artists who haven't worked on large, permanent public art pieces to get experience and expand their practice on, let's say, smaller pieces. So what you see here is one piece that we installed last year called SOS Safety Orange Swimmers by Anne Hirsch and Jeremy Angers, which talks to the refugees, the global refugee crisis. This was installed right next to the ferry terminal in Harbour Square Park. Just quickly, some other temporary pieces that we've installed. And on the left is it was called Flight Mode, and this is a project in shipping containers that we collaborated on with the South Asian Visual Arts Centre in the car park space under the Victory Silos. This is underneath here on the left is a mural, done by Under the Gardener by Jackie Comrie, who uses color to address mental health. And then up here in the middle, we sort of collaborated with the business improvement, the BIA, and to sort of bring some of the water, so the winter stations down to the waterfront. It used to be called Icebreakers, but we had something called Loop at York Street Park, and the sort of seesaws at Harbourfront that some of you in Toronto might have seen. But really, before we formally had a temporary art program, Waterfront Toronto was always strove to commission artists and partner with the city to animate the waterfront with temporary installations, performances, and murals. So these images that you see up here on the right are, and down here are murals and installations and performances that Waterfront Toronto had already commissioned. So what's next for our temporary art program? On the left here is a really, really exciting project that we've been working on with Contact Photography Festival. This was supposed to go up in May, but COVID postponed things. But what we're planning to put it up this summer. There'll be like 8 really large-scale billboards along Villiers Street in the Portlands. that focus on, that sort of show buildings that have been demolished or are soon to be demolished as part of the Portland's flood protection project. So, you know, keep an eye out for that. And then here on the right, this is something that's sort of really close to my heart. It is a new artist residency that's just gone up. It's still, the call is open. This is a project that we're collaborating on with the BIA, and it's a 16-month residency that's really focused on community engaged art, and you know, we'll ask artists to sort of really engage with the waterfront and its communities and projects that are happening down there, and you know, and then sort of roll out a series of projects in the Year of Public Art in Toronto. That's, you know, next year in 2021. And finally, Waterfront Toronto tries to bring as many cultural events down to the waterfront as possible. So, you know, we'd like to see our shoreline as a hub for arts and culture, you know, a place that's full of activity and experimentation and creativity. So last year, the Toronto Biennial came down to the waterfront, and in past years, we've had Art Spin, Nuit Blanche, and Luminato at the Hearn host major events and venues on the waterfront in our public spaces. So we'll continue to partner with organizations and events sort of to bring as much cultural programming to the waterfront. And that's it for my presentation. Stop sharing. Over to you, Crystal.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to see them there. Thank you, Chloe. It's wonderful to hear a little bit more about the priorities established by Waterfront Toronto, and I look forward to hearing a little more about that big project once it's awarded and becomes public. I think we're going to move over to David now, and David's going to talk to us a little bit about what he's been up to. David Turnbull has been with the Edmonton Arts Council since 2009. He holds a Master of Art Conservation degree from Queen's University and a BFA from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. The most rewarding part of David's job is meeting artists and understanding the work they do, while thinking about how artists can build communities and bring people together. Please join me for a presentation by David Turnbull.
Hi, thanks. I think that was fantastic, and I think that a lot of the things that Chloe had to say also apply to some of the things that we're trying to do as well here in Edmonton. So I'm just going to pull up my presentation here. So the Edmonton Arts Council has been around for, oh geez, I'm totally unprepared for this, 1996. The Percent for Art policy with the city has been around since 1992, but the actual collection, public art collection, or civic collection as we just call it for short, with the city has been around since at least the 1950s, but never really formalized until about 2008. So Edmonton Arts Council is a not-for-profit organization. We are an arm's reach organization that operates through a service agreement by the City of Edmonton. You know, some of the things that we do, and public art just fits in as one of these things, is the bulk of what we do is project grants for artists. We do travel grants, we do operating funds for art organizations and festivals. We host artists in residence. We run poet laureate programs, workshops and events. We also do public programming, and then we also have a retail ticket and sales outlet as well. You know, the public art is by far the most visible thing, and probably the most, I think in most cities, it's the most political thing as well. So in 2008, we had a public art master plan that was created. In 2007, the public art policies were overhauled from their 1992 status. And really it was to formalize what kinds of projects would apply for, or would qualify for permanent public art projects in the city, and what the funding mechanism was like. But in 2008, there was a public art master plan that was created. And this really was an ambitious 10-year plan that went along with the current 10-year cultural plan of the city at the time called the Art of Living. And, you know, it really looked to kind of catalyze things from as far as public art goes within the city to, you know, create certain initiatives to really spark things off and start to place public art in a more contemporary way within the city. That completed in 2018, and you know, as the time went along over those 10 years, some things were dropped, some things were funded and carried out through other organizations. Some things were up for reassessment, and we just decided, well, they're not really relevant anymore. In 2018, we began the next 10-year plan, and this is what we call Connections and Exchanges. So this is the city's cultural plan to transform arts and heritage for the city of Edmonton. The big three ambitions, as we kind of see as our North Star guiding light here, is to create a city that's alive with arts and heritage, create a hub of extraordinary creation and reputation, and create a thriving and well-funded arts and heritage ecosystem. But in short, the mission is just to infuse arts and culture and heritage into every aspect of Edmonton's civic fabric, and support those creatives and grow audiences. So how we currently work is we carry out a series of policies on behalf of the city: the Percent for Art, public art administration, conservation, reciting and deaccession policies, and we work through a service agreement through the city of Edmonton. So we are tax funded. Like most municipalities, at least in North America, you know, 1% of eligible qualifying construction costs go towards new public artwork. According to the policy, it is for permanent artwork. And so this really limits what we can do as far as temporary works or transitory works and more experimental works. But because of the nature of the permanent nature of it, we do quite a bit of project support, working with artists and with the city. We have a collections officer, we have a conservation officer, we have project officers that act as support for the artists as well. Conservation support is there as a resource for the artist, but it's also there as a resource for the organization and for the city themselves too. Because if we're looking at, you know, making something that's as permanent as possible, it really starts from that early conception phase of the ideas. Right now, we manage a collection of over 250 permanent artworks. We've got anywhere from 30 to 35 on the go at any given time. And we have various methods for acquiring public art. In the past, we would work through standard RFP and RFQ methods. We've put the RFP process on hold for a while for a number of reasons. One, because we wanted to make sure that artists were paid for their ideas. And two, because when artists were proposing ideas, we kind of questioned how relevant they actually were in a public art realm. Or within public art practice. And by that I mean, do they really have an opportunity to do research and respond to the site conditions and to the environment as well? And when you are basically going through the selection committee and you're looking at the various proposals that artists are submitting, you know, there's a good chance that some of these artworks will not be realized for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So really, how relevant are they by the time that they're created? So now we're going through an RFQ process where we have the artist shortlisted, but then we go through an interview stage with the artist, and then we support them through their concept development work, and also provide them with support through curatorial support as well, that is independent of us as the funders. So we like that idea that we can actually support artists through their idea making, because we know with a lot of artists that often will operate in a vacuum, and it's a very difficult way of working. These are just some very broad examples of some types of artworks that we have in the collection, from indoor paintings to outdoor sculptures to cast iron monoliths to land art dating back to the 1970s, 1960s mosaics in a really harsh environment within a city like Edmonton. We have some fairly monumental pieces as well. that, oh, sorry, my timer has just gone off because I wanted to make sure that I gave myself lots of time. Anyways, some fairly monumental works by some regional artists as well. Other Canadian artists working in various media. We do experiment quite a bit with various media in Edmonton, partly because it's a really harsh environment where we are a fairly young program as far as the formalization of the program goes. And from my point of view as a conservator, when I first came on in 2009, I was really interested in seeing how some of these modern materials fared in the environment. So we really wanted to make sure that not only were we testing, but we were also trying to do it in a responsible way. We have some sound art, which we are currently dealing with, upgrades in technology. Modern plastics. This is an international artist group from Germany called Inges Idee. Indoor plastics with local up-and-coming artists. Contentious pieces such as our Talus Dome, which was, you know, every city has their piece that everyone hates, or they love to hate, or they grow to love it. Neon pieces. We have a 60-yard neon outdoor piece that we discovered we shouldn't maybe not have done after we had a hailstorm right after it was installed. But at the same time, the trade-off is that this is, while it's it's a very sublime and beautiful piece. We're always looking at ways that we can integrate artists within the design teams to maximize how much the artists can get paid for their work, and also piggyback onto the construction project. So this is a rain screen facade design. And of course, you know, we were the host city, or the final stop for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission a number of years ago here in Edmonton. And, you know, we really started looking at the collection and started looking at, okay, if we want to really start building our collection in an equitable way that represents the citizens, represents the history of the place, we really need to work much more closely with Indigenous artists, change our practices, and then also do curatorial assessment of our collection to actually look at what some of the inequities within the collection are. Not just from a diversity of background, but also a diversity of material and medium, because one of those things that, you know, we're always restricted by is, of course, the permanence of things. We pride ourselves quite a bit on working with artists who have also had their first time working in a permanent public art realm. Sometimes these go off the rails, sometimes they turn out to be spectacular. And, you know, this is where I think our program is really strong in how we work with and support artists through the process. We're not here to micromanage, but we are here to support artists from international, from national, and from regional as well. So where we're at right now, I'm actually going to stop this part of the presentation because I know I'm out of time, is that now that we have done the first work on a curatorial assessment of the collection to look at what we have and really contextualize what we have, because a lot of municipal public art collections are not created with a curatorial angle to them. You have discrete pieces scattered around the city without much that ties them together other than the fact that they're owned by the city. So now that we've done a curatorial assessment, we're starting to pull things together to contextualize and actually start to develop a collection strategy of how we want to go forward into the future, working with emerging artists, working with local artists, regional, international representation, and how we also want to branch out into high-risk projects from a technology standpoint, a material standpoint, as well as temporary opportunities as well, because I think that's where, like Chloe had said, there is a lot of opportunity to really open things up. So I'm going to stop there. I've actually got about 500 more slides to go, but I'll hand it back over to Crystal because I know that we've got lots to cover, and I might be able to pull back in a couple examples of some of the other projects that we've been working on as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much, David, for walking us through some of those projects and giving us a sense of the priorities and the strategy developed by Edmonton. I had a chance to look through some of those images, or at least images on the council's website, and was struck by just how dynamic the examples of public art present themselves on screen. I mean, there's an incredible use of color in a lot of those works, myriad approaches to materials. And at first blush, I looked through those thinking, wow, this is not what many kind of portfolios of public art can look like for a city. So I'm just curious to know, and this is where I'll start some of the questions, and not really with all of the questions I outlined earlier. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious to know what has that transition looked like for you? Has it been noticeable? Did it start before 2008, or is it really in 2008 when the master plan was revised that you started to see those changes happen?
Yeah, I mean, I came on in, like I said, in 2009, and oh, my alarm just keeps going off. I don't know why. It keeps reminding me that I'm long in the tongue. Anyways, yeah, so I came on in 2009. I was aware because my family moved to Edmonton in the 80s, and at the time when the program really started going, I was working in Denver at the Art Museum there, working with the modern and contemporary collection. So I was aware that there were changes that were starting to happen, and as a practicing artist, before I left Edmonton, I was also aware of what some of those earlier opportunities were in the late 1990s, early 2000s, because I had even applied for some of those. And I think that some of the result of what came out of a lot of those earlier calls were what we would all consider to be fairly traditional public art. Bronzes, painted metals, fairly large, somewhat abstract, but also fairly accessible from that public interface point of view. And really, I think that for Edmonton, it really was when Talus Dome happened in 2011 or so. That's kind of when, I mean, it really is this giant stainless steel, not too dissimilar from Cloudgate, not nearly the size, but really kind of spiked that football down in the ground and just said, public art is here. This is what public art is going to be from now on. It's going to be in your face. It's going to be difficult to ignore. It's going to take some chances, not just material wise, but in where and how we position it within the public realm in a non-passive way. And I think that really was a big turning point for how we approached building the collection. Mm-hmm. Because we really wanted public art to be visible, we wanted it to be seen, we wanted it to be impactful. And as a result, that kind of approach actually drew in a lot of artists, especially international artists that we had never seen apply for anything before. And our public art director at the time really had her finger on the pulse of who was doing what around the world, and how to start pulling that into a city like Edmonton.
That's good to know. You mentioned Cloudgate, and I know that Chloe knows a bit more about that project, and I'd like to bring that into our conversation. So, discussions about how public art can have a magnetic effect on a collective audience, whether that be the community that is host to the work, or the tourists who make the pilgrimage to see the work, and this is where we might think of Anish Kapoor's Cloudgate in Chicago. Chloe, I wonder, given your experience managing the public commissions for Chicago's Millennium Park, which is where Cloudgate is housed, has that work transformed how you approach commissions? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I wasn't managing the whole of Millennium Park. I collaborated with them on one particular project. I mean, it was a really big project, but I didn't manage their whole roster. But I mean, I think, when people think of Millennium Park, they immediately think of Cloudgate, and which is, it's that's just normal. But it's important to remember that there are also other works there. Yes. I think there's Crown Fountain by Plenza, which is, just as incredible. But there's also the Boeing galleries, that have rotating temporary pieces, and that's the area that I worked on for a few years, because I was sort of helping them on a commission for sort of 6 temporary pieces for those galleries. Now, even though they were large scale and up for 1.5 years or so, it was still a huge project. But really, I mean, just like any other public art project, I learned really valuable lessons about fabrication, about shipping. I was working with an artist from Mexico, so I had to, but I was working here in Toronto. So it was a case of administering, something that was happening in Mexico or that was being built in Mexico and then shipping it to the States. And all sorts of things about, maintenance. How do you balance wanting people to interact with these sculptures and educating hordes of school children not to climb up them and grind the gravel into the surface. So all of those lessons I take into, all the commissions that I work on, whether it's multi-million-dollar art piece or whether it's something that's $10,000 worth. They're all lessons. So, and I mean, a lot of us in public art are looking kind of beyond the massive kind of sculpture on a plinth to works that are more subtle and community engaged or ephemeral, and I really think that there's room for everything, if it's done well. So, the incredible thing about Cloudgate and Crown Fountain is that they're very engaging. You see yourself reflected, you play in their waters, they have a sort of very dynamic relationship with the built environment around them, and therefore they're constantly changing.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question for David that I think is tied to some of what you touched on in your presentation, seeing images of the Indigenous Sculpture Park. So like many municipalities, Edmonton's public art collection is a combination of works that were purchased or acquired to beautify public space and work that was commissioned to animate spaces with very specific functions and histories. Some of the successes that I see in Edmonton's program include the increasing presence of mid-career artists, and the recently completed Indigenous Sculpture Park is a good example of that. What exciting changes have you witnessed in how the public engages with these new projects? And can you tell us a little bit more about the evolution of that particular sculpture park?
Sure. So I think I'm sharing my screen. I think I did that kind of prematurely. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So the Innu River Lot 11 is the official title for what we call the Indigenous Art Park here in Edmonton. This was a project that unfolded over the course of, depending on who you talk to, 5 years, 7 years, 6 years. It was a fairly lengthy process. This is a park where it actually set a lot of precedents for how we operate and how we think now. This is a park that came about because the park was under redevelopment. The original public art master plan had called for a series of, or a network of art parks throughout the Edmonton's River Valley. I mean, Edmonton is loved for its river valley and its network of trails and connections and bridges and natural spaces. But it's also an area which is extremely, extremely significant to the Indigenous people of the area. And specifically this area where the Indigenous Art Park lies, because it was a gathering spaces for a number of various bands and families to come together, to trade, to partner, to share stories, and check on everyone. I mean, it really was a gathering space. And so the park itself would not have contributed very much significantly in dollars at all. We were able to actually work within the constraints of the public art policy at the time to reallocate funds from another larger composite project to fund this. And so that's also set precedents for how we approach some of our larger composite projects now, and how we start thinking about public art planning around the city, and ultimately how we think about redefining the public art policy completely. So I mean, this park is important for so many reasons. not just because of the art and the place that it holds. A lot of the artists at the time, so we broke this into categories. We worked with a curator for the first time. So we brought on Candace Hopkins, who was phenomenal to work with over the number of years, because when you go through this space, we have 6 artists represented here. They worked with local communities. They learned from local elders. They really, and only one of the artists is actually from this place, and still resides in the city. But really it was about, the importance of this place is not just to make it an important place just for the Indigenous populations. It really was to represent that this is a gathering space and the importance of bringing others into that space. So when we look at the history of other public art projects in the city, like Talus Dome, where one of the most contentious aspects of it wasn't just that it was a pile of shiny balls next to the highway, is that it cost $600,000, and it was commissioned to a couple artists in Los Angeles. They weren't local. To me, this is a perfect example of why it's important to actually reach beyond your boundaries, to bring ideas into how they reflect the space, how they experience your spaces that you see every day. But it's also important to bring those artists that are from here together with those other artists. So a lot of these principles, a lot of these values that this art park really demonstrated through the 5 to 7 year span that it occupied to realize, really is the basis for how we are thinking around public art through everything that we're doing going forward now. So we have, at the time, we had a couple emerging artists. So we had Amy Malbeuf, whose syllabics are represented here, and Tiffany Shaw Collins. We had 2 mid-career artists. One was Jerry Whitehead, who was originally from Saskatchewan, and Dwayne Linklater, who's from Ontario. And then 2 established artists. One is Marianne Barkhouse, and you can see her piece on the plinth in the background there. And Marianne Nicholson, who's now based out of Victoria. Here's Marianne Barkhouse's piece. Dwayne Linklater's is on the left there. The whole idea of breaking this into emerging, mid-career, and established artists was a little weird. It was mostly done for budgetary purposes. And from the outside, it seems to make sense, but once you're actually in the process, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the reason is because when you take these emerging artists, such as Amy Malbeuf and Tiffany Shaw Collins, whose piece is here on the left, this kind of land art piece, they really were, they didn't have experience working in public art before. So when you put as emerging artists with a small budget who are wanting to represent themselves in the same league as established artists who fully understand what the scope of what they can do and what their budget can allow for, I feel like they really overshot. And I mean, it took a lot of work to ensure that they didn't lose money on it, because that's the one thing we never want to see as artists actually losing money on a project. So we had to look for different ways that we could support them and find efficiencies within the project. Of course, as this went along, these 2 artists are, mid-career to established artists at this point. Dwayne and Jerry are definitely no longer mid-career artists. I mean, these are significant artists within the country, right? Jerry's turtles are there in the background. So I think that kind of answers your question, Crystal. Yeah. I mean, it really did set a lot of precedent for how we work with artists, how we support them, and that realization of, artists are capable of different things, and there are different levels of support where you need to come in. But also this was our precedent to really just take the policy and just blow it out of the water. Right?
Yeah, I appreciate that backstory. It definitely changes, and I think maybe amplifies the value that I had attributed to that project without even actually experiencing it firsthand. Now I have to go back to Edmonton to see it. And I think what you mentioned is something that I'd love to have Chloe's insight on too. You touched on mid-career, early career senior or established artists. And I think for those of us who've been part of juries, we know we often see a sort of usual suspects paraded out for certain RFQs. And it can be kind of hard for folks who are just trying to get their foot in the door and get that first project. They may not have a solid base of subcontracting contacts. They may just really be starting out, but there's so much promise in what they've been able to do within the studio, and yet, you know, their concepts that might be bringing forth could potentially be more compelling than those being brought forward by the folks who know their materials in and out and know the process like the back of their hand. So I'm wondering, and maybe I'll direct this to you, Chloë, what thoughts you may be willing to share on key ways that artists can prepare for that transition of making the work in the studio to working specifically for a public space.
Yeah, it's super important because we all ask ourselves these questions, and I can give some kind of concrete advice because I've actually worked on projects with or have just sort of awarded projects to artists who haven't really done much public art, So I think the key is, number one, make a really strong proposal. And, because the thing about, artists who have done a lot of public art is that they're really adept at like doing good proposals because they know how to do it. So it just always bears saying, because I cannot tell you how many times I come across this, and I'm sure David has too, is that, everyone has to send in what's required. We get a ton of submissions, and even artists who have done a lot of submissions tend to, just if what is asked for is send everything in one PDF, or if what is asked for send 10 images, that's what you have to do. So because if you don't, it looks really unprofessional. And in fact, you're pretty much disqualified right from the start. So, do a really, really strong proposal. Get some great images of your work, of your previous work. So studio work, whatever you've got, get some really, really good professional photographs done. That really matters. And in your statement, maybe, explain how your studio work could translate into art in the public realm. Write a really inspiring statement that'll get the jury excited, but also be practical. So, perhaps, a really good idea is speaking to artists who have done public art and ask them really practical questions. Artists will always help each other out in general. So, grab the phone, talk to, an artist who has done lots of projects, and really just ask them all sorts of questions that'll help with your proposal. Specifically, fabrication, installation, and budget too. Ask them about how to do a budget or how much things cost in a ballpark. Another good sort of piece of advice is collaborate maybe with a good fabrication studio. So that juries can rest assured that there's really good experience behind it. And we have just awarded a quite an important temporary art piece to an artist who hasn't really done much work in the public realm. And this artist had teamed up with a really good fabrication studio. And so that gave the jury kind of, the sort of I don't know, it made them feel at ease that this could actually be done, on time and on budget. Let's not forget that public art, requires expertise, and it's technically difficult. If it's not, engineered properly, it can fall on someone, and no one would want that. So, we can't cast that aside. I mean, and just lastly, also, think about partnering with, an experienced artist to make a team. I love seeing collaborations and teams of artists. Some can be, as I say, you can always team up with someone who's had more experience. The City of Toronto does a lot of mentorships for their large public art projects. But also, find smaller projects to start with, like, temporary art pieces or the artists in residence. And that will give, artists, experience on smaller projects, and then they can, slowly, build to the larger ones. So yeah, that's some advice that I would give.
Okay. Yeah. David, do you have anything to add to that? Any insights from your vantage point?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I love public art that takes risks. And so maybe I'm not the most responsible or best person to be heading a program.
We need people like you.
That's really, bent on permanence. But that said, I mean, there's responsibility within it, right? I mean, we as the commissioning agents, the artists, the fabricators, they're all responsible for making this stuff work. But I really think that if there is a push from the municipality to invest in that capacity building for up and coming artists looking to move into the public art realm, I mean, it's the public art, the discipline of public art is not the same as studio art, where you take your art and you just put it out in a public space. I think there needs to be some more work done around communicating what public art really is and what public art means to different cities. They're all going to have a very different definition and different approach to it. For us, I mean, we're always looking at ways that we can kind of shake things up and open it up so that, studio artists can get their stuff out into public spaces. So if we're looking at, art parks where we can do loan programs and bring artists on and use their work for a few years, we can actually work with those artists as well on the care and maintenance of their stuff in real time through real exposure in this climate, which I really appreciate. But I think also, the practice of doing public art when we're looking at what it means to do art in the public realm to respond to its environment, for the environment to respond to it, and for the different type of interaction that you might get from it than for a studio-based artist or a gallery artist. It is very different. So definitely there's project management skills, because it really is managing that project, because you need to somehow get it done and get it in the ground as best as you can. And I think having that support network of, people who are willing to help you out. And I mean, I think if you can find a conservator who's interested in materials, who wants to work through some challenges and some ideas, that's pretty cool. From my conservation training, I've always got to give a shout out to conservators. We're not all risk adverse. Most of us are, but once in a while we give the nod to a giant neon, because why not?
The unsung heroes of our profession.
I think that there's that material science thing, right? And it's not something that all fabricators are aware of either. But it's a growing field in the conservation field, is modern materials and public art materials as well.
That's a great tip for folks who are thinking about different avenues into which one might work in the arts. So there's a number of great questions that are coming through the chat, and I'd like to share them with you both now. And so you've touched on some of the topics that are coming out through the chat. So I may modify some of the questions. My apologies to the wonderful, insightful folks who've shared the questions. But we have one question here that asks, are all public art projects framed as competitions? Have either of you worked with artists in other ways, for example, in a mentorship, long-term relationship model? And the asker of the question provides that, or states that they ask because RFQs can be daunting, and we've all spoken of that. And for many folks who are working in a solo capacity, that may be quite a challenge. So I'm wondering if you two could talk a little bit about how mentorship might unfold in your respective positions.
David, do you want to start? Or I mean, I'm trying to think of all the projects that I've done. I mean, particularly in a municipal context. I mean, the thing about working in a municipality is that, you know, the dollars are sort of tied up. There's public money, and so you know, there's an issue around sort of fairness, if you like, and that we have to give everyone, you know, a chance. And so, you know, the point about putting out these open calls is that anyone conceivably could, you know, could apply. I mean, you know, as you said, you know, some of the problems around that is that it becomes, you know, the same people that apply, but, you know, hopefully we are thinking of different kinds of projects. I mean, like, you know, my artist in residence, you know, is very much a different kind of call for more community engaged art, and, you know, and a sort of, you know, really the idea of sort of thinking about, you know, the residency being not so much about the product, but around process and thinking, really, you know, thinking about new ways of engaging the public and using our public spaces, especially after COVID. So the residency just becomes a different thing. And it's a much longer period where, you know, we can work with the artists and so they can expand their practice. And but it's still an open competition. You know, there are a few instances when I suppose, you know, when it's I mean, when I used to work in Mississauga, I mean, I think if it was anything under $10,000, you know, we could do a sort of a direct commission. Mm-hmm. You know, if it was a sort of deemed a small amount like that. So, you know, I did do a couple of those that were just directly commissioned, especially if it's a sort of temporary piece that needs to, you know, it needs to get going fast and there's no time to do the sort of long process of open calls. But I mean, usually, as I say, it just depends where the funding comes from. But I mean, I think probably the same for David. If it's in a municipal context, we usually have to do these open calls. And I think it's just really important that people, you know, don't look at RFQs as something very daunting. I mean, RFQs, in particular, you know, requests for qualifications are, you know, a short artist statement and your qualifications and some images. It's not a full-blown proposal. And I think that, you know, if you do it really carefully and well and really talk to other artists who have done it, I think it's possible to just to do it well and just keep on sending them out. You know, I mean, I have definitely awarded, you know, some projects to artists who have not worked in the public realm before, you know, and so it's you know, I think you just have to keep on doing it and get better at doing it and not feel daunted about it, you know? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's why, you know, we try and look for all these different opportunities to try and mentor artists and get emerging artists in the door, give them those opportunities. So, I mean, we do quite a bit of transitory or temporary programming that's outside of the Percent for Art. So like the art loans that are studio based, we do some temporary you know, billboard and LRT and bus projects, vinyl wrap projects, things like that, where, you know, it gives those artists that opportunity to get something out there into the public realm without having to worry about the permanence or any of those responsibilities or constraints of materials. It really just frees them up. And we're always looking for opportunities where we can, you know, informally pair artists up. Not necessarily as a formal mentorship, but if you just bring artists together, what kind of things can happen. So with our latest round of calls, we had a series of calls for the new LRT line that we're developing in the city. We had 2 calls that were for design only for artists, for local artists only. And then we had 2 integrated larger commissions that went to regional and national artists. And what we've started doing and experimenting with is in trying to figure out how we support those artists, but also looking for ways that the mentees can also offer some support to the mentors to make it that reciprocal relationship is, you know, get those artists together in a room with a facilitator or with a curator in this case, so that they can each learn about what one another's practice are, what one another's histories are. They're for artists who don't know each other, and all at different stages of their career. So we're kind of doing this as a little bit of a lab experiment to see just what the potential is. And if we can kind of let them guide us where they need that support. And then for us to learn from them about what kind of changes we might need to make and what other kind of opportunities would be positive for the artists as well. But for the most part, I mean, we try and keep our RFQs as simple as possible because we want to give artists that equal, fair potential to represent themselves and present their portfolios to a committee themselves without just being judged on the quality of the images, their CV, how much experience they have, all of that. I mean, the committee is really charged with looking for the possibilities and the potential in these artists.
So just to piggyback what you said there a moment ago, Stephen, we have one question about framing your RFP or RFQ. If in the past you've worked collaboratively, but you're trying to branch out and develop a bit of a solo practice in this area, can you provide any suggestions on how to frame one's experience? Is it okay to just include your collaborative work and the successes that have happened under that framework?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I encourage artists to do that. But I think that what has to happen, and this is what I see in a lot of committee meetings, is the committee members question what level of involvement each artist had. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's really important to discuss. I mean, if you're partnering with a fabricator, is that fabricator a collaborator or a creative partner, or are they just a fabricator? If you're partnering with other artists, what does that relationship look like? Because I think in order to be able to show, you have to show the committee where your strengths are, what your level of involvement was. And I think you also have to be able to show them what you've benefited or what you've gained out of that partnership, right? I'm always looking for the potentials and failures of, what have you learned? How do we build on this? Okay, let's do this a different way next time, and maybe let's not screw up quite as much. I mean, how do you build? But I think that that's where it's that transparency on what your involvement was. Mm-hmm.
We have another question about online resources and finding where one might be able to locate some award-winning, or even just an example of a winning RFQ or an RFP, or I guess a number of artists will include RFPs or renderings for projects that haven't necessarily been awarded but were proposed. Do either of you have any suggestions on where folks who are wanting to get into public art may look for examples of exemplary proposals?
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if they put actual proposals in there, but I always find that, I think it's called the Americans for the Arts. They have a really, really good website, and they give all sorts of really great, sort of advice and examples on their website. So I would look at that. It's hard. I mean, I don't think I'm actually allowed to share any sort of anyone's RFQs. Like, I mean, I think that would just be a breach of I don't know. So, like, I don't think I have information. So, but I think, I think a few of us are always, I mean, I think people do workshops, yes. And I think that, the City of Mississauga did a really good workshop recently on proposals, really, really nuts and bolts. And I'm not sure if it might well be up on their website. I would have a look on the City of Mississauga's website, because they did a really, really good practical, talk and workshop on proposals, and what, the anatomy of it and how to do them well, and did give kind of examples. I mean, not of particular proposals, but, what constitutes a sort of a well-framed image, and not all those kind of things. So I would look on their website, and if you can't find it, write to them and ask them if they can post it. But, and the City of Toronto is always, is planning things. And I think especially during the Year of Public Art next year, there's going to be all sorts of workshops and lectures and talks and, about public art. Yeah, I mean, I can't, can you think of any other kind of online sources for this, David?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of just reaching out to artists. And I'm a
me
big
too.
fan of reaching out to the administrators that administrate the programs. I agree. Yeah, we can't share the actual winning package, the submission package, but you know, it's not just the RFP package. It's what happens after. These are two-stage processes, right? So that's just to get you shortlisted. It's what happens after you're shortlisted is really the meat of it. But I think that, you know, I have no problem being approached by artists to take a look at a submission package, to take a look at a portfolio, to say, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? I think there's other artists out there to use as resources. And I would even go through your own municipality and their collections and find out, you know, if there's local artists that have won commissions or that have representation in that city, I would just give them a call and buy them a coffee. And
Absolutely.
And ask them to look at to either look at your proposal or look at theirs for tips, right? Like, I think that's the absolute best way to get that, because it's not just
agree there. I agree.
It's also getting that feedback, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, look for your own mentorships. And I know for sure some artists who have done that, who have really, really struck up a really great relationship with, you know, other artists. I mean, and you know, and got a sort of mentorship out of it. But and I'm sure it's like asking someone, you know, how did you get that job? And most people will say, sure, you know, let's talk about it, and give them all sorts of practical advice. So definitely use other artists who have won competitions and done all sorts of work. You know, just go out and ask them. I'm sure that yeah.
And I think go back to the administrators too, and you can ask for jury comments. You can ask for committee comments. You can ask for feedback. I mean, and we try and offer as much as we can, you know, and we set that stage at within the selection committee meeting, is that this has to be constructive, and we want to be able to offer constructive feedback to the artists. So, and that really changes the tone. If you've ever been part of any selection committees, they can, you know, they can go all different directions, right? But in the end, I mean, if we're looking for constructive feedback to really serve artists, to help them build their careers, we wanted to make it as constructive as possible.
I might also suggest that a great resource that can be found online is the Public Art Toolkit. It was produced as part of the Creative Cities Canada Network of Canada, published in 2010. There's great information in that document, resources, and it was prepared by a number of curators who were working in Vancouver. And of course, we know Vancouver has quite a robust public art program as well. So if anyone is looking for that, you can find that on creativecity.ca. And just do a search for Public Art Toolkit, excuse me, and you should be able to pull it up. I'm just going to see if there's a last question. Okay, can you give advice on how artists should work on their budget? Anything they should watch out from the start, etc.?
Inflation.
Sorry?
Inflation.
Inflation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Public health concerns.
Well, I mean, look.
Yeah, go ahead.
Budget, again, I mean, this is, you know, I think in Mississauga, in that workshop, they gave a very good breakdown of what your budget should compose of. But, you know, just sort of looking at best practice around, you know, around what percentage should be, you know, your, the artist, sort of the artist fee, you know, I would say don't set, you know, don't put aside too little or too much for the artist fee, because I think that's gonna, you know, I mean, if the jury says, you know, sees that an artist has just given themselves, you know, 5% artist fee, then they're gonna say, well, you know, they need more money, or, you know, they should put more money towards, or if they're putting, you know, 70% towards their artist fee and 30% towards the art, then that's also going to be a problem. So it needs to be a little bit, you know, I'd say like a 20% kind of, you know, 20/80 or something like that, but, or 25, something like that. But, you know, also contingency, you know, that's something that a lot of artists don't put in there, and it's just really important. It's really, really important to put a contingency in there, a 10% contingency or whatever, you know, and I think, and just do some homework, you know, ask fabricators, or ask what, you know, like give them a ballpark figure so you can put it in there. So don't just kind of like pull numbers from you know, from anywhere. Just you know, do the homework and ask around, ask the actual, you know, fabricators or installers around how much something costs. So yeah, but I would say contingency and artist fee are some things that I sometimes feel are a little off balance.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that you know, there's a tendency to underestimate things like engineering and where you may need additional assistance from other professionals.
Yeah.
You know, but I do think that, you know, if depending on how long your project is planned for. So if you're applying now and a project, like, I mean, we have calls that we're putting out now, but we know that the LRT line isn't going to be open for 7 years. And if the artworks and the artists are selected now, how do they, you know, they're projecting what the cost of things are going to be in 5 to 6 years once they enter fabrication. And in some cases, I mean, with what's going on, like with aluminum right now, those costs can just skyrocket and they can completely break the bank. So I think not only is it the contingency, but it's your contingency, but it's also, it's the projection of, and protecting yourself against what you have no idea that you don't know about yet, which I have no idea how you do that. Can't see into the future, but yeah, you really, I think that's one of the riskiest things, is that when a project really stretches, that's where you really need to do your due diligence when you're working through your contract. Your contract with your service providers and your contract with your commissioning agent. Because unfortunately, with the majority of capital projects, the public art is 1%. And what an artist gets paid from that 1% is, you know, 15 to 20%. So it's a very, very small amount that the artist is actually making, and therefore the risk is quite high for what they're expected to deliver. So I think that's probably the only advice that I can give is, I mean, you really need to know what you're responsible for and what others are responsible for.
You're right. Build in cushioning, because it's always gonna, things are always gonna come up, and none of us want them to want that to be, you know, coming out of an artist fee.
Yes,
Absolutely.
contingency, very important. David and Chloe, thank you so much for your time this afternoon and for the wonderful conversation. There were so many questions that came through the Q&A, and I haven't been able to forward all of those your way, but don't be surprised if folks start contacting you with more of those in the future. And I think I'm going to hand it off to Jan, who's going to close things up for the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal.
Thanks. Oh, maybe it's Rebecca.
Not yet. Rebecca.
Sorry, Rebecca.
I want to start my closing by thanking everyone who's joined us today. We've had well over 100 people from all over the globe tuning in to listen to what you've had to say, which is so exciting. And of course, right after that, I want to thank the three of you for a really, really dynamic conversation that found that perfect medium between very practical and a little provocative as well, which has been really interesting, even for those of us who have been working in this field for a very long time. So I hope it was informative to people and kind of tantalizing for people who joined in. I loved a few things that, in particular, a couple things David said about public art not being just the same as taking a studio practice and putting it in public space, and that there's this whole kind of experimental leap that happens when you put something out there and see what happens. There's so many parameters and sort of safety issues in terms of physicality and materiality and finances and all that sort of stuff. It's really heartening to have people like you discussing these projects, this panel, and self-identifying as risk takers, because it would be horrible to think that we were just being safe on all fronts. And to close, just to mention again one thing that David said, every city has their piece that everyone hates or loves to hate or comes to love. And I think as long as we don't try and please everybody all the time, we'll continue, you know, as an industry, keeping people talking about art in the public realm, which is really important. So we have one more of these webinars coming up on Friday, same time, same place, which is 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that is on Materiality and Fabrication. It's a conversation between Canadian artist Mafandli McLeod and conservator Catherine Machado, moderated by artist Jason Lujan. And once again, this series is co-produced by Varley Art Gallery and City of Markham Public Art Program. And really that is the hard work of Yan Wu and Anik Glode, and they've been a pleasure to work with, as has everybody on the panel. Thank you very much for joining us and hope to see you on Friday. Bye-bye.